know who Marshall Sprague was? See? Okay, I'm done. And how many of you know him by more than one book? How many of you can shout out what the book you know most likely is? Newport in the Rockies. Okay. So he is that, and he is someone who was very provoking. This might be how we see him. If we see him in pictures, we might see him as the author at the old-fashioned typewriter. By the way, my students, many of whom are concurrently enrolled high school students, and so they have a particularly young view of things. Many of them think that all typewriters ever were like that one. They don't know there was anything. They know the antique one, but they don't know there's anything in between. It's interesting to tell them about IBM's Selectrics and how exciting it was when they got that little ribbon that would correct things. And so Sprague is also known as a jazz man, right? He was one of the leaders of the jazz community, had bands that he played with regularly. He's most known for his books on mostly Colorado history topics. And I'm trying to show you all of them in several slides just to make a point about how proliferating they were. Notice the very first one up in the upper left-hand corner is going to tell you why he came to Colorado Springs, and I bet you know what that was. I've written a couple things here. One of them is an example of how he was a provocateur for causes. And in his book Massacre, which is about the Meeker Massacre in western Colorado, he does something that not very many people were doing at that point, particularly on the subject of a massacre and particularly on the subject of a massacre of white people by Indians, is he defends the Indians and defends the situation they were in and how better they should have been treated, to the point that he had a congressman read it into the congressional record, that this story should be used to better treat Indian people. The writing I've added at the bottom. A bunch of us who did local history were once asked by some wealthy people in the community to write a sequel to Marshall Sprague's Newport in the Rockies because it needed to be updated, because they give it out so much as a welcome to the city. They didn't understand that the dilemma that a lot of academic, scholarly, museum and library district kinds of historians would have with being asked to update and make a sequel to Marshall Sprague. Marshall Sprague is Marshall Sprague, and what he wrote stands alone and doesn't need to be updated by anyone else. Plus, academic people have problems with Marshall Sprague. However, I am going to make the point that I often make, that local historians and journalistic historians do a tremendous good deed for the whole field of history. Other books you might recognize. One example of how seriously he is taken is when in 1975 we were going to have a nationwide series of books, one on every state, where the expert in that state would write that state's book for the bicentennial of the United States. Marshall Sprague was chosen to be the one to write Colorado. That means that he outsold academic historians, frankly, and usually popular writers do. His biggest flop in terms of sales was So Vast, So Beautiful a Land, which is about the Louisiana Purchase and really is an excellent history of the same. He tried to convince everybody how important the Louisiana Purchase was and worked really hard on that. It's something that needed to happen and needs to happen still. My students never pick it off a list of topics to give speeches on. He also wrote a lot of what we might call contract or corporate or organizational histories in Colorado Springs for different organizations. As you already could tell from what you've been hearing, he was part of a social set, right? We're really seeing an interesting group of literati, of cultured people who came to Colorado Springs thanks to that awful lung disease. And then he also wrote someone else's autobiography. He promised once to help a man who came back from education and culture in the East to rescue a small Colorado town, a man who he called Ferry Carpenter. He promised once to help Ferry write his own book, and Ferry died before that happened, so Marshall did it for him. There's Ferry in Hayden. Marshall Sprague's schooling has a lot to do with the kind of man he was and the kind of writer he was. It also struck me as interesting just to compare his prep school with the little college he went to down the road in New Jersey. So he came from an elite family, particularly more elite in educational sense than extreme wealth, but the writing school that, quote unquote, that he had while he was sent away to boarding school at Lawrenceville on the left is one where the faculty advisor to the writing projects of the students was Thornton Wilder, the playwright and novelist. There was a newspaper and several different student publications, and Marshall Sprague wrote for all of those, often later crediting his ability to write on schedule, write at a certain length, and so on, to that initial experience. And then he went on to Princeton. At Princeton, he also developed his jazz band habit. And interestingly, look what they got to do on summer trips. They played on cruises. There is a passport required. Brett and I were just discussing it. Thank God that you did not have to have this passport to come here, Brett. It's tuberculosis. Did you listen to this? How many of the famous people, how many of the people who made a difference in Colorado Springs came here because of tuberculosis? And that was true of Marshall Sprague. So he went to, on the recommendation of his doctors back east, Dr. Gerald Webb, who is, of course, one of the stars of the field in our local history. And Dr. Webb was an angel. He met him at the train the whole time that Sprague was recuperating here. He brought, at Glockner Hospital, by the way, he brought him books. He taught him bird watching out the window and then brought him books to study the birds. And as Marshall Sprague said, Dr. Webb stood between me and the dark. This was when Marshall Sprague was still a relative newlywed, and by the way, his wife, who we're going to talk about momentarily, had rented a little house for him called the Chester Allen Arthur House for them to stay in before they got their own home here. He said that Dr. Webb gave him his own love for life. And in those long periods, and I think if you're stuck in bed for a really long period, that's a great time to decide to read scholarly history. And so it helps you rest. And so he did. I tell my students textbooks, right? Doorstop, or if you have insomnia. In 1943, one of his most successful articles was in Good Housekeeping, What Not to Think About, and How to Be a Positive Thinker, which is something he got, he said, from Dr. Webb. There's the house that's most famous as Marshall Sprague's house, Marshall and E.J.'s house at 1523 Wood Avenue. They raised their family there. I do want you to be aware of the role of this woman. I think most of us will realize more and more over time what an impact E.J. had, both in the city, Edna Jane was her name, and in the writing of her husband. But you can see she was a player in the Civic Players. So on the right, she's in one of her costumes. Her clothing was of interest to the fashion editor of the Gazette-Telegraph and the Free Press. And her achievements, again, a very educated background, but notice we also have her writing behind the scenes for lots of organizations, her writing and editing and advising on his books. She became interested in garden clubs, City Park, became the president of the Garden Club, and ultimately was the first woman on the Colorado Springs Planning Commission and the first woman chair of the Colorado Springs Planning Commission. And her interest was primarily to do things for the environment here. One of the things you also see, and one of the reasons that Chris twisted my arm a bit, is to recommend the Marshall Sprague papers. The Marshall Sprague papers here in special collections, downtown there, in special collections, is a wonderful treasure trove of things. And so one treasure for John, right? Frank Waters and Marshall Sprague were both friends and were both published by Swallow Press and writing a lot with mutual acquaintances like Alan Swallow. So there's some great Frank Waters letters there, and this one in those papers is where Waters waxes nostalgic about growing up in Colorado Springs, and it has the same halcyon days quality that John was giving it as he spoke. Marshall Sprague was collegial. This is something nice to see. And so Marshall becomes part of our local history, but it already was the trend that our history tellers here were people from within our history, like Frank Waters, like Mabel Barbie Lee of Cripple Creek Days, right? And of course Lowell Thomas. The letters between Marshall Sprague and Lowell Thomas are really amusing because Marshall Sprague was constantly pulling Lowell Thomas's leg. Marshall also was a PR man for the area. Before he wrote most of his books, one of the things he was doing was a lot of feature articles about this area for the New York Times. And as I started to look through them and realize this is the New York Times, and what he's doing in one after another is writing about the skiing and the ski industry and why everyone in the East should come out to Colorado this winter because this crazy veteran of World War II is doing this at his ski resort, and this crazy veteran of World War II is doing this at his ski resort. And I realized that you could do a study on how much impact advertising like that had on boosting our ski industry's growth. Another thing Marshall Sprague did that's in the papers, and lots of it, is talks. So here we are. He would have been here every year. Right? And he would have been at every club and every organization and every event that you called him to come to for even anything. I mean, it didn't matter what the organization was, he'd come up with it. He began in the first few sentences with most talks saying, "It's so nice that you want to listen to me babble again." And you can see the variety of organizations. One thing that struck me too, because I'm looking at the collection of his stuff, is that when he did talks, slides were slides, right? So we talk about these things as slides because we talked about those things as slides. And imagine having to deal with those as you give a talk. The other thing that I discovered about him was that he had a kind of wicked quality, yeah? And it kind of goes with Lillian in a way. And one of his wicked moments is when he realizes that because he's done this research and he's doing this writing on the Meeker massacre, and I'm going to explain to you momentarily that a huge contribution of his is to publish the key elements of the testimony of the women and Indians who were involved in that situation that no one had dared touch. And I say it that way very purposefully. The women held captive in the Meeker massacre situation were raped repeatedly, horribly, and didn't want to tell it, didn't want it to be public knowledge, certainly didn't want it published in the Gazette or anywhere else. So Marshall Sprague does it. And I thank you, Marshall Sprague, as a historian of women in Colorado. But one point where he's going to give a talk about this, when he's just starting to give talks about it, he's writing to himself about how he's going to go talk to a group of little old ladies about women being outraged. And he can't wait to see their faces. I know you'll read the letter before you care about what I'm adding to it, so I'll just summarize what's fun about this letter. Marshall Sprague kept things. And so he kept things for us that belong in historical archives that might never have made it otherwise. And he loved this letter that he got because he was working with one of the organizations about its history. This is a 1912 letter where the members of the Cheyenne Mountain Country Club are informing that, much to their sadness, that this request to allow rag dancing, which means ragtime dancing, it's really sort of two-step, but rag dancing should be discouraged at all annual balls. I can just see Marshall loving that. And I've listed for you the historical method I see in Marshall Sprague, all of which, except number 6, is compatible with academics. He located and solicited recipients. He interviewed them. He mastered the literature first. He also, notice, picks out topics that are not often done. And the number 6 is where he tops the academics. He does not write in a scholarly, oft esoteric, and thoroughly cited way. Queen. One of the ways that Marshall Sprague provoked us historians, was that in Newport and the Rockies in particular, but also in other ways, he tended to seem to minimize women, and particularly Queen Palmer, and portrayed her as a frivolous girl. Well, she was 18, but a frivolous girl who was spoiled, and even a castle wasn't good enough for her. And so she, on a whim, decided to go live in England and made her husband go visit her if he wanted to see her. That bothered a lot of us and caused us to talk and write and research, and caused us to apply women's history and an awareness of things like, if she had something like a heart attack at high altitude, that's not whimsical, that's not a whim. And that if she didn't want to live in places, maybe you want to look at the places he had her living in, not in the castle, which was built later. And as we compared and talked, we created a revision of Queen Palmer that sticks. And so he provoked us into doing it. And without him, I'm not sure we would have done it. Remember this thing? Okay. On the left is the comparison that Rick gave you about the sane concern over nuclear energy, and in the middle is the Heinlein response, Patrick Henry, let's be patriotic. I've taken the sane one and enlarged some of the names on the list of the people who signed on to support it. And now you see Mr. and Mrs. Marshall Sprague were sane, as were, by the way, you already know at the top, Mr. and Mrs. George McHugh, and there's a little name Tilly and a little name Warner in there. And Marshall did the same kind of thing in a letter to the editor Fight over a 1969 Colorado College Symposium on Violence, where there was nudity and foul language. And the mayor, Mayor Eugene McCleary, said he would not tolerate unpatriotic statements, filth, nudity, or obscenity of any kind in Colorado Springs. Close your curtains. And so Marshall Sprague, who was his friend, wrote back and said, "I'll bet nothing has inspired such sanctimonious horror since Martha Graham pranced around in her interpretive bare feet at the Fine Arts Center opening in 1936. Even good friends of mine should know better." So Sprague took on some responsibility in his social roles. And I want to say that historians generally agree, with Marshall Sprague and E.J. that his best book might have been Massacre, not Newport. Massacre is an amazing case study of first-hand research in obscure primary sources. That little box you're seeing in the upper left is not a very good photograph, but that's the little box of microfilm that's in the other Sprague collection, which is at Colorado College Tutt Library Special Collections. He called on the microfilm from the National Archive so that we could find out what those women had to say and what the Indians, who were the victims of bad policy in the first place, had to say, and open doors that other historians were not opening, especially academic ones. So Marshall Sprague, and that's a picture of the site, by the way, where E.J. is walking through where this all happened. She thought it was his best book. David Lavender said it was his best book, great historian of the West. And so Marshall Sprague was a great historian. He was a journalist. He said he never claimed to be a historian. He was called that often. He always said, I'm a feature writer. And what that included were a lot of the skills of a good historian. And he said he didn't say it, Dick Noyes. Remember the Chinook bookstore? Okay, Dick Noyes called him the historian laureate. Marshall Sprague didn't claim to be a scholarly historian. We shouldn't hold him by that standard. We need to be thankful, though, that he was a little devil and quite the provocateur. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. The symposium is a terrific asset to this community in helping us to document and remember our history, and I'm delighted to be part of it. I am a huge fan of Manley, Ormes, and Eleanor Ormes and the work that they produced in this book, the Book of Colorado Springs, which is available. I don't know if it's available today, if it's sold out, but if you have any interest in the history of Colorado Springs and the Pikes Peak region, this should be on your bookshelf, and thanks to PPLD for reprinting it. Now it's available. It used to be if you found one in a used bookstore, you would have to tackle somebody in order to get it, and then you'd have to pay a pretty price. For those of us of a certain age, this was a defining part of us understanding local history. And so really I'm here to say read this book, and credit to Pikes Peak Library District for reprinting it. Thank you very much. So I want to do a quick bio of the authors, and then give you some perspective why I think it matters, why this book is of use to us as scholars. So Manley Dayton Ormes, born in 1858, same year as the gold rush started here in Colorado. He raised outside of Flint, Michigan, north of Flint, Michigan, and was schooled at Yale and later Yale Seminary, and came to Colorado Springs to enact his passion, which is to lead a flock as a pastor. His wife, Eleanor Reddy Ormes, was from Philadelphia. She was trained as an artist at the Philadelphia Academy of Arts, and when she came to Colorado Springs, the two of them married and spent the rest of their life here. You can see her here with one of her children. Of course, those of you who are interested in the geography of Pikes Peak will probably know Bob Ormes, the old man of the mountain, and the Ormes Atlas, and his other work in advocating for adventure, often undirected adventure, in the Colorado mountains. It is these two that we have to thank for their work in publishing the Book of Colorado Springs. When they arrived in Colorado Springs, Manley went to work at the Second Congregational Church. The building still exists. It's on South Tejon Street. It's now an office building. But here it is in a historic image during his era when it was used as a church. It's a great building, and while it's not a church, it's terrific that we still have it in our community. While he And the years he was there was from 1890 to 1904. And if you're interested in going to look at this, the building is located at 407 South Tejon Street. While he was there, of note, for those of you who are interested, again, in local characters and local names, he actually performed the wedding of artisan Anne Van Briggle during that era while he was serving as a pastor. Ormes participated with many other people in community organizations, including, we love this, this float, which must have been used in a parade. The date on this is 1896. It's identified as this Colorado College softball team. And it's fun to kind of tear this image apart and look at some of the characters. But Manley Dayton Ormes is right here. So he's of our interest. He lived his entire life with this prodigious mustache that he obviously took great pride in. Of interest to us, also at the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, is the person sitting next to him right here. That is Francis W. Kragen. If you have interest in local history, Kragen is another name to take note of, and is worthy of a session at one of these symposium in the future. Kragen, also a Colorado College faculty member who took passion in trying to document the history of the American West, just as Ormes did. He got so passionate about it, he quit his job at Colorado College, ended up going broke following his passion. He died at the Myron Stratton home, and as they were cleaning out his apartment there at the Stratton home, they were throwing everything in the dumpster, his life's work, which was not complete and only in manuscript form. And the museum was able to save the collection, and it now is one of the most significant documentary collections about the history of the American West there is anywhere. And just a wonderful, wonderful story. And it shows that on this float, two people who helped us to understand our past just happened to be there playing softball, apparently. Although I think this must be baseball, not softball. I'm not sure when softball was developed. Next to him, of some interest might be Professor Slocum, who became somewhat infamous later on. And Mrs. Slocum is among the ladies down here, but also among the group of women inside the carriage is a woman by the name of Sarah Jackson. She went on to marry Philip Loomis, so Sarah Jackson Loomis, a very important photographer, and we have about 20,000 of her images in our collection. But Philip Loomis, notable for the iris garden just outside these doors. He was a hybridizer of irises. So fascinating photo just in and of itself. But again, like so many of us, new to town, comes to Colorado Springs, seeks ways to engage in the community beyond his role as a pastor. While he was, religion was his work of choice, he was a clergyman by training, but a librarian by instinct. And he would later go on to be hired by Colorado College to run the Coburn Library and really to establish the library program at Colorado College. He was passionate about collecting materials, adding resources to the student library, and so that they could be available and useful to both the students and the faculty. If you want some interesting time, go read his archival material at Tut Library, and the ways that he worked to get money out of the administration so he could pursue buying materials and otherwise acquiring those materials for the library. There was a lot of wagering going on and begging and borrowing and, I don't know, stealing, but he did work very hard in order to develop the collection. In 1906, he was recruited and added as a member of the Saturday Nights Hiking Club. And for those of us who know Bob, his son's work later in the mountains, he was doing the same type of work. A byproduct of his hiking experience and his passion as a man of the mountains was in compiling and publishing his Mountain Trails of the Pikes Peak region, first published in 1913, published in numerous editions thereafter, and distributed by the Chamber of Commerce. And these are still wonderful sources for information, especially those of us in the parks world who are interested in the history of trails in the Pikes Peak region. And my first interaction with Ormes is through his Ormes Index. And anyone who is familiar, and I can't believe anybody in this room was not familiar with Pikes Peak News Finder, and its resource as an index of local newspapers, have a huge debt of gratitude to Ormes for his work in indexing the local newspapers and creating a way to get access to important dates and events in our history. The museum has a cast-off version, really, an edition of the Gazette and Telegraph newspapers that were given to us secondhand from Tutt Library. And as we go through it, I don't know if you can see, but there is a check mark right here, a pencil mark right up there. And I believe, I don't know that we'll ever be able to prove this absolutely, but I believe this is the methodology that Ormes used as he went through and identified these indexed items. And you can actually correlate articles that are checked this way in the full bound copies that exist in our collection to the index entries in the old, what used to be a paper copy of the Ormes Index. And it was an invaluable way for me as an outsider, a person from Iowa who came here, to get access to major events, major themes, major issues that happened in our history, and to begin understanding my new home. And here are some of the indexed entries and the methodology that he used to organize this information. And there are contemporary accounts of Ormes taking these giant bound copies home. I lug these copies around at the museum so I can utilize the newspaper, and some of them are just, unwieldy is a generous term for them. But lugging them home on his bicycle to his home in the Old North End, and spending his evenings, his own private time, going through them, identifying important events reported in the newspaper, and then tracking them in this method. Of course, it's that was really his passion. He was a compiler of information as a librarian, but also a compiler of history. And it was interesting, his obit, if you read his obit, it says that perhaps the only name in Colorado Springs history that didn't appear in the Ormes Index was Manley Dayton Ormes. And of course, today, as I mentioned, his work lives on as the Pikes Peak News Finder, which is now my go-to source if I have to find quick information about an event. So this is the index to the original, or the contents of the original version of the book. And it really, you need to understand when you sit down to read this, it's not a narrative history. It compiles information by themes, by topics. It's not typically a book that I would sit down and read cover to cover, although I have over the years. It's unlike Newport and the Rockies, as an example of a different type of book, way of compiling a story. This is about getting information and making that information useful and organized so that that people can get access to it. But what's so remarkable about the book is the discoveries that you can find. Because he was interested in just getting information about the different things that were happening in Colorado Springs up until the time the book was published after his death. And so you have to understand it as a snapshot in time. It's not complete. It is things that interest him, so the index is not complete. It is the things that he's identified. So, but with those things in mind, the types of information available to us because of his work is just remarkable. One of those items is this, the Keeley Institute. And I'm not sure how many of you know the Keeley cure, but it was a very common treatment across the country And there was a local Keeley Institute here from 1892 until 1894. So a very short time, but it was very important to us. In fact, the National Keeley Conference was held here. It is a way of treating alcoholism through chemical treatments. It's important because Leslie Keeley, for whom it's named, was the first to begin to recognize alcoholism as a disease instead of a moral failing. And the idea that this was happening here in town helps to bring context to what Colorado Springs isn't isolated. It's part of things that are going on nationally and internationally. Keeley said, alcoholism is a disease and I can cure it. And it was revolutionary, his treatment was revolutionary because of this focus on physiological and medical conditions rather, as I said, than moral failings. It was a 4-week treatment, beginning with you imbibing as much alcohol as you wished, which seems counterintuitive. Daily injections of something that they called bichloride of gold, which was a mysterious solution that people were very curious in trying to find its contents. It was said to contain a variety of things, including strychnine, morphine, willow bark, ammonia, atropine, and alcohol. It was a mysterious red, white, and blue liquid, depending on where you were in the treatment. So it was also patriotic. And it's interesting just to see the local component of this larger issue. I will just say that it was investigated by the leading investigative journalist of the time, Nellie Bly, who you may know, who went and submitted herself to the treatment and ended up writing a piece that she titled, or that was titled, Nellie Bly Takes the Keeley Cure, A Week's Experience and Odd Talks with the Queer Little Family of Hopeful Inebriates. I'm going to wrap up by saying that for the most part it is tries to be a factual recounting of the things that Manley Ormes has mined both in the newspapers and through his other sources. And it is a pretty neutral account. Although I think there are some openings for some criticism. There is very little discussion of Sand Creek, but the discussion that does exist, he refers to American Indians as incorrigible and ruthless, so he was a man of his time. Sometimes his opinions would seep through in other places, and I just want to read you what he wrote about a building that I'm fairly close to, the El Paso County Courthouse, in which this may have been written by his wife Eleanor, who was the artist after all. And it's written in this book, one of the last pages of the book. Perhaps the oldest of our present public buildings is the county courthouse, completed in 1903. Imposingly located in the South Park with its clock tower, elaborately rising among the trees, it is a monument to political connivance, rather than an expression of what it should stand for. It was designed by one Augustus J. Smith, who was not only prodigal but wanton in his use of form, undoubtedly lacked discrimination with materials. He must have been somewhat of an erratic, for after finishing his work at the courthouse, he became a religious enthusiast, preaching on the street corners. When that phase passed, he designed and made bathroom fittings. So that's the whole coverage of our beloved 1903 courthouse. Manley Dayton Ormes' life ends abruptly, as does his book. Eleanor finishes completing the text by raising subscriptions and paying for its publication. And he dies in 1929 of double pneumonia. And here he is outside of his home at 1623 North Tejon Street. He lived in Colorado Springs for 39 years, and he has helped us to understand this terrific place. And really, I could say nothing more than, if you haven't read this book, you need to. So.
Hello, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caleb Hall, and as mentioned, I'm a UCCS heading into my 3rd year there. I want to thank the library for having me here today to share you all a paper that I got a really good grade on. I'm joking, but although that is true, this research was for a class, but the content of which ended up having more relevancy than I could have ever realized. And I hope to show you all in how that is true. So a little bit about me. As I had mentioned before, I'm soon to be 3rd year student at UCCS, and as you can see in these pictures, I am a theater and dance major. Understanding this about my background is critical because it plays a huge role into how I understood the family story of the Bandhauers and how I was able to then research it. I've come to find that my work centers on historical relevancy and sharing untold stories from the past. And I find that there are lessons that we still have yet to learn from these people like Shakespeare, Moliere. It's why we produce their works still. So when I began what seemed like a semester-long paper, I had no idea at the time how applicable these cookbooks were going to be to my own interests. The paper started with an unconventional beginning that led to a very unconventional research process. At first, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to focus my topic on for this entire semester. I felt compelled to do something from Manitou because I was from there, but I had no idea what to do at the time. Upon talking with a friend at work about my troubles to find a topic, I came to find that she was a 5th-generation Colorado native. She offered me these wonderful cookbooks that her family had and said I might be able to derive a topic from them. What I came to find was a wealth of knowledge of family history that was held within 3 volumes from these Colorado pioneers. There were so many things that I could have possibly researched, and after talking with my professor at the time about these books, I was conflicted because I had to pick a topic, but the whole class was focused on learning how to make a research paper, not breaking the rules and then doing whatever you wanted. She insisted, however, that I go ahead and focus entirely on the cookbooks as sources themselves, and so I therefore pulled external sourcing and developed a topic from there that was interesting to me and I think to everyone here. The research turned into a true and honest story of what coming to the Pikes Peak region was really like, and cut out all of these cliches and misunderstandings that I had about the middle and lower class families who helped found this land and make it what it is today. I was enlightened to a unique, new, and interesting story that connected everyone, even everyone to this room, to the founding of the Pikes Peak region. Before we go into depth on these cookbooks and the historical significance of this family, I'm hoping that you all entreat me to an exercise that we do in theater to understand characters in a play. When we look at characters in a play, we try to understand the situation of them and the way that they process and reason themselves. This same mentality is important when looking at history, but I think that it oftentimes gets overlooked. The beautiful thing about this family is that they are representative of the demographic that many of us would have found ourselves in when coming to this land ourselves. So in understanding this, I find it critical to understand what makes the Bandhauers so resilient and so resourceful. Now, I was fortunate enough to discover that among the wealth of knowledge that's held within these cookbooks, there is a description of what being a Bandhauer is. Unlike a script, we are lucky enough to have been given these answers, but I found this description to be crucial because these are things that the family holds as core values and a creed to their existence. It reads things like, you are thrifty and resourceful. You have large knuckles and wonder why. Your ancestors built the West, milked cows, kneaded bread, and you inherited their hands. No band, however, sat underneath a magnolia tree. You have a streak of wonderment in you, whether it's UFOs, a Ouija board, a fortune teller, or even stargazing, and wonder what's really up there. The best place to you is home, and your 5 best strengths are hardworking, resourceful, honest, dependable, and fun-loving. This family holds as much pride in the accomplishments that they have achieved as much as the work that it took to get them there. And I think that that's a very beautiful thing. The family wanted to leave a mark, even if they didn't always have the resources to do so. And I think that that's where this poem from Clara Bandhauer becomes so important. Keep these things in mind when we're learning about the history. Qualities like these played a critical role in even the earliest beginnings of the family in the United States. Records of much of the family's history were destroyed after World War II. However, what had lasted was a story that was passed down through the generations of the family about how Johann von Bandhauer escaped Prussia and fled to America. And I'm going to share that story with you right now. In the mid-1850s, Count Johann von Bandhauer and his wife Henrietta were attending a ball held by the Kaiser in Prussia. The word got out that an enemy army was approaching, and all the counts would be beheaded at midnight. Johann left Henrietta in the middle of the dance floor, jumped out of a window, and ran for the harbor. He got on a ship and came to America, settling on the banks of the Mississippi River in Missouri. It was then that he sent for his wife and 2 kids. Now, this man also fought in the American Civil War, and as you can see pictured here, his left hand was blown off when he attempted to catch a cannonball that was fired at him. So, after the entire family came to Missouri, the 3 sons of Henrietta and Johann, Robert, Julius, and August, all became cattle herders. Eventually, the siblings split apart to the effect of Julius heading south and the 2 brothers, Carl August and Robert Frank, both heading towards Colorado. Now, very little is known about the life of Carl August Bandhauer. What we do know is that there's a tombstone marking his existence here just outside of Denver. We also have a story that's left about how they attended a saloon. At this point, Carl August had lost his eye in battles and fighting for the army, and him and his brother came into Denver in 1871. They both stopped at a saloon, and Robert told August to keep an eye on the horses. So August proceeded to take his glass eye out and set it on the saddle, where he then went into the bar. As you can see, fun-loving is an important trait to the Bandhauers. It was in Denver that Robert Frank Bandhauer met Elizabeth Fakir, and they eventually wed. Elizabeth's upbringing by many standards of the time was unusual for women. At the age of 14, Elizabeth came to settle in Denver. Unlike situations of most other students her age, she was able to go on to college and achieved a degree in music by the time she had turned 18. Her and Robert both met and became married in 1876. Together they opened a small blacksmith shop. Robert was also part of Denver's first fire department and became an alderman later. He contributed to the Denver's first city government. The blacksmith shop, which they both owned together, named R. Bandhauer's New Carriage and Wagon Works, gained a popular reputation. The company did the ironwork for the Tabor Grand Opera House in Denver for Mr. Horace Austin Warner Tabor. He was also a patented inventor of many different products that we still use today. Of these was this invention here, called the Improved Combined Tire Upsetter Shears and Punch. It was designed to simplify what would have been hitherto slow and tedious operations. In other words, it was used for repairing wagon wheels. However, he also created many unpatented inventions as well. The modern-day meat hook was made by this man, as well as the ice skate key, which allowed for his daughters to put on their skates under their shoes. An article was written in 1879 about Robert Bandhauer that stated that Robert had been chosen by nearly a unanimous vote to represent the 6th Ward in the Board of Aldermen in Denver. This brought a time of great respect to the family name as leaders of Denver and hard workers. Elizabeth would remain busy doing the house chores and providing for her 8 children. Life was good for a while until the family eventually lost it all. This is Robert again, and that's the HAW Tabor Opera House. In 1893, the United States switched to the gold standard to support our dollars due to the immense amounts of gold that were being discovered all over the country, specifically in gold mines like the Victor and Cripple Creek ones. The switch was a central point to many of the conflicts that the country was faced with at the time. While the federal government had struggled with the conversion to the gold standard, many people still advocated for the silver standard, like Robert Frank Bandhauer. In 1878, this free silver movement got the silver dollar restored as legal tender. However, this was until the eventual switch to the gold standard in the country. When this switch occurred, many people had invested in silver and therefore lost many of their assets. People like H.A.W. Tabor and the Bandhauers. This forced many people to therefore sell many of their assets, and other things that were lost in the Bandhauers' name was the Bandhauer family business and the family manor that stood where the modern-day Bronco Stadium now sits. Now, with nothing to their name but a baby grand piano, they moved to a valley near the South Platte River to start over again. This became the homestead called Shadybrook Farm, with much shade and a babbling brook. Shadybrook had a 2-story house, an ice house, a spring house, cabins that they could rent out, a large garden, barn, and a dance hall. The dance hall proved to be a way for all of the Bandhauer children to eventually meet other people and marry off. The Bandhauer family of the time, Robert and Elizabeth, both left Camp Shadybrook in the 1930s and went to live with their daughter Clara in Colorado Springs, where they eventually passed away at the Myron Stratton home as well. Both of them passed away from brain hemorrhages, Robert dying in 1935 and Elizabeth later in 1936. They left a great story of their settlement and many children to pass on traditions behind them. This thus ended the early settlements of the Bandhauers in the Colorado Springs region. Camp Shadybrook has still lasted the test of time in an ever-changing world, standing as one last reminder to the people of the area and the influences of the Bandhauers on the Pikes Peak region. The camp embodies the values discussed in the research. While camp outlasted original owners, it stands as one of the symbols that represented the development of the area from the perspective of a family just trying to survive. The camp is one of the larger and more well-known structures from the family that they had left behind and that has stood to this day. While the family no longer owns the camp outside of Deckers, Colorado, it now serves as the modern YMCA of the Rockies, Camp Shadybrook. It's where you send your kids when you want them off the couch. So, a core value of this family lies firmly in the values of cooking food and sharing recipes. This seems to be a unifying factor between all of the houses and families of the Bandhauers even since, and serves as a reason why these cookbooks are also so fascinating. Polio eggnog is a recipe that stands out in the pages of the cookbook. This recipe stems from the experience that Carol Jane Potts clearly Todd had as she fought against polio herself. She recalls going swimming one day in July of 1948, and she says that a few days later she was eating a piece of bread and jelly and could not swallow. She talks about when the doctors had discovered that it was a type of polio called Bulbar Polio because it attacked the brainstem, the whole body, and especially all vital organs above the waist. She was hospitalized and put in an iron lung to keep her breathing. While in the hospital, they would feed her eggnog down a tube 3 times a day. She survived the disease. She considers this tragedy to be a blessing for her, as she claims that if I die tomorrow, I know that I have lived life to the fullest extent possible. The polio eggnog therefore holds a special place in the family's lifestyle, and it has a story that they hold deeply, one of strength, perseverance, and surviving. The family has also used and collected these recipes that have shown historical significance to the Pikes Peak region's history. They kept ones like the Manitou water lemonade recipe. Manitou water lemonade has been a favorite of the region since the 1850s. The water is said to have been healing because of the Ute god of all Native Americans, Manitou, lived beneath the springs. It is said that no Native American was ever refused water from the spring. No war paint was ever worn when attending the spring. The Manitou water was advertised to those suffering from tuberculosis as a health resort and an opportunity for people to ride on the railroad from General Palmer, his railroad, the Denver and Rio Grande, for a chance at good health. This recipe came to represent Ruth and Henry Clark, descendants of the Bandhauer family, and the many trips that they would take to come visit Colorado Springs, both in 1902 and then again in 1953 there. Mount Manitou was a train at one point, not just a thing to hike up. Therefore, this recipe came to be a part of the Bandhauer family and the integration of their family into Pikes Peak culture and community. The Bandhauers, like many other families from this area, are still around today. Within these cookbooks stand many different instances where descendants would revisit locations of their ancestors themselves. But in leaving legacies, we oftentimes discover the importance of everything, down to even the most mundane of items. We see how different families hold certain traditions near and dear. But in learning how the Bandhauers were able to attain so much more knowledge than just family recipes, the cookbooks become an entire experience in itself, or in themselves. I'd like to give a little insight into what going through the Bandhauer cookbooks is really like. I'm not sure why, but this is a portion of the presentation that I get a little bit emotional by. Here you see a page of the cookbook as it stands when you look at it. Now, reading through these countless recipes, you're forced to read and experience family information and photos that all somehow pertain to a recipe within the cookbook. In those instances of looking up a grandmother's pie or things like polio eggnog, you are given the family stories with the recipes. This makes these loved ones relevant and always part and present in your life. You get to see their faces as you look up the recipe. So the function of these cookbooks in that way are completely unique. These cookbooks also stand as a rite of passage in the family. Each year, or each time a descendant marries, they are presented with a copy of the family cookbooks. And the cookbooks are constantly growing and changing as the family grows and lengthens itself. You're also given opportunities for parallels within even your own family tree, such as the countless milestone events that occurred about dancing within the Bandhauer's family history. Upon research, one of the descendants, Ginny Phelps, made a discovery back in 2005. She found that in the old Bandhauer Bible, she found a newspaper article about Leap Year Day being a traditional time when it was okay for women to propose marriage to their men who were either too shy or too slow to do it themselves. So it seems that Robert and Elizabeth Bandhauer met on the dance floor in Denver in February 1876. Their daughters met their husbands in the Shadybrook dance halls in the early 1900s. At least one of their grandchildren, Joseph H. Potts, met his wife, Roberta Clark, at a dance in Manitou Springs, Colorado at Hiawatha Gardens in 1930. And in 1978, the first job that the YMCA gave the Potts family when they volunteered to help rebuild Camp Shadybrook was painting the dance hall. So the applicable nature of these cookbooks leaves us all wondering where do we stand in this? And it stands as a question of how can we possibly represent ourselves to future generations and how do we possibly leave a mark? But it starts with just that, leave a mark. All of these pictures are seemingly mundane items that are found within the cookbooks themselves. Things like journals and receipts. One of those is a sticky note, and from different transactions and things like that in this family's history. Now, we cannot possibly know what information is going to be valuable to our family members and descendants down the line. However, like the Bandhauers have collected in their cookbooks, family history can be seen in the most seemingly mundane of items. Sometimes it isn't the fact that it isn't what the note says that your mother leaves, but the fact that she leaves notes for you that is significant. Connection to family is more than reading about them in a book. It's about experiencing their lives and keeping them relevant even today. So I inspire you and I encourage you. Go tell your own life story, however that looks for you. Thank you.